Hello, and welcome back to the sim. In this one, we're jumping back into SPAD.next to do, I guess it's 3A or 3.1 in the new user series. Now this is applicable for others as well, as we're about to get into a new version. As you can see here, we're running v0.9.12.76. This is the alpha and the beta currently, as they're running at the same time. So now that SPAD is moving into beta and we're getting pretty close to the release, it's good to cover what's changed and how buttons are going to function moving forward. So let's go ahead and use a great example, the TCA yoke. Now any of these buttons and functions, previously what would have happened is we would have been able to go to our button or our device settings, and you would have seen previously jumping between a few different modes. Now right away you're going to see that there is no longer a normal push button and a simple push button. There is push button and there is switch mode. However, even with push button, you can still do all the same functions that you would have had from a switch, plus more. Also, by keeping it all standardized, it'll make it easier for sharing devices and less confusion. Let's talk about what we can now do even with the push button mode. So what you're going to find when you click on a button is when you go to add event, there are now additional types. Button pressed is very similar to what we had with a simple push button, as well as it's the equivalent of a switch on. So with this type of button, you of course can still add conditions, and you'll notice repeat has now been removed because it shouldn't have shown up here, and it kind of created some problems and confusion. So it's been removed so people don't accidentally use it. You still can add actions and change data and do all that functionality, which we'll cover. However, what we're talking about is the other pieces. So what you're going to see now is you no longer have the ability to repeat or hold the button for multiple events, even with the button pressed. Now this is why we used to switch from a normal button to a simple button, was so we could have button pressed, button released, and we could apply on button pressed repeat events. So that has been removed. So a button pressed is an instantaneous selection. So the moment that we press the button, that event will fire. However, holding that is not going to repeat trigger for button pressed. That also means that button pressed doubles as a switch on event. So button pressed and switch on, same thing. So if I've got something that is a switch, so like the gear lever, I would use button pressed for the switch on event, and then button released for the switched off event. You've got pressed short and pressed long. So pressed short is going to wait for the release of the button to actually register if you held it for less than a quarter of a second. So if it's just simply a click, it will register that. Now this was what was part of the normal push button. And with a button short event, you have the exact same things. You can add conditions, you can add those actions and events, and then again, there is nothing for holding or repeating. A pressed long event is going to wait for the button to have been held for 1 second. And again, that way, once it crosses a second, it will fire off that event. There will be no repeat capabilities, but it does mean that you're able to assign things for short presses and long presses. So for example, when pressed for a short time, so less than a second, it's going to send the autopilot off event. But I had it that if I hold it for a second, it will disable both the autopilot and the yaw damper. Again, this allows me to have two things on the same button, which I really like. However, you could have also had things that on any button press. So maybe at the same time with this button, whether I press it short, press it long, I wanted to add a press event that might, say, reset my camera. So as you can see, you can use all of these at the same time. You just have to be cognizant of what it's doing. So in addition, you have the button released. And so this will send an event anytime the button is now released. So again, very valuable because this is also the equivalent of switched off. So this is why you can do everything that all three types could do with the standard type now. And the others really aren't needed. So a button release event might be like a push to talk, where here we're using a VJoy, as I've explained before. That was just so I could have multiple yokes and joysticks, all press push to talk inside of vPilot. But for that, you want a button pressed and a button released event. So on the press, while being held, or like a switch while on, it's going to hold down that VJoy button as well, which is push to talk. And then when I let go of the button, or turn the switch off, it is going to tell that VJoy to also release, and therefore turn off the push to talk. Finally, the last of the button interaction types is button held. And so this is the one that has the changes. This is now what allows us to have repeat events. And also what this allows you to do is select how and when you want the held to take place. So that threshold that defaults to 500 milliseconds, or half a second, you have to have held this button for a half second before it starts firing the events that are applied to it. Then, in milliseconds, it's how quickly it repeats. And 25 milliseconds, or 25 hertz, really, I shouldn't say 25 milliseconds, 25 hertz is the equivalent of what it was before, which I think is actually 40 milliseconds. So your 25 hertz frequency is how quickly it's going to, or how frequent it's going to keep sending these commands. However, that's based on you first getting over this threshold. So if I did want to use this like I did a simple button before, where I want this event to fire instantly, I'd want to set that to 1. So I want the least amount. So the moment it presses, it starts firing events. On the flip side, for some people, they may want this to be left at half a second. That way, when you're using button pressed events, and so if we looked at a trim event, for example, so maybe I want button pressed so that I get my trim, so it fires off a single trim event. And then I might want the same thing, but using button held. And so that way, it doesn't fire too many events too quickly because I've set that threshold down, right? So we're talking about the threshold. If we set that down too far, then it might fire a bunch of events when I'm trying to still just click it once myself. So this is where this added threshold is something we didn't have before. So this is huge. This allows you to have button press and, well, I'm going to send the same event a lot, but it's got to be held a little bit longer so it doesn't kick in the repeat too soon and make it hard with some of these things like trim where I'm trying to give it a single click or give it 2 manual clicks so it doesn't accidentally go into repeat and send 5, 10 of them faster than I want. And this segues us into, well, one of the other things that always sucked was I want that, but I don't want to have to re-enter all this information again. Well, that is where we do have something neat that's been added. So now when we copy this event and then we paste it, when you highlight that event, you now have a trigger event that you can change it. So under the editing of the event, we now have changed trigger to. And so it was set for press, so it's grayed out. But now I can pick any of the other events that I want to change it to. So we can now change that one to held. And so now I've got the same condition, same event, but it's going to wait. And once I've crossed half a second, then it'll start repeating. So now I can still have the single press, fire off my single events, hold it, then it starts repeating. So that is awesome. Pretty much all of the new things that cover the adding of events and editing of events regarding the new button types. This is what's coming, and you need to be aware so that you can make changes. And one of the things that could happen more frequently is you might load a profile and you might find something like this, where a short press was to press and release the V-joy, but this was supposed to be a pressed event. So you might find that with this update, some of your devices, what used to be a press is now a press short time. And so what you want to do is use that feature of changing your trigger, setting it to press, and quickly updating and saving your changes. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this one. Please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and don't forget, from that homepage, video guides. This is where you can find all of this content. It makes your life a lot easier. Things are sorted. That is one thing about YouTube. It's not like you can really sort stuff very well and put things into categories and sub-channels. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day.